Hey, everybody.
Hi, thanks for coming.
Yeah, ready to talk about racism? So,
I am.
yeah, always. I think we've both been having this experience where we're like, so we are going to be talking about some depressing stuff. I hope everybody's ready. But your narrative has a very nice, redemptive, hopeful arc to it.
Yeah, I hope so. I always sort of hoped it would be both a little bit of a sounding of an alarm in terms of how massive this ideology is.
It's a book about Derrick Black, who is the heir to the hardcore white supremacy movement, who then goes to college and kind of finds his way out. And we'll get into much more detail about that. But there, I imagine, are two ways for people to see the story. One being, this is kind of core to the concerns of our moment, and another way that people might be motivated to see it as a fringe thing, or as a, well, how many heirs to the white nationalist movement are there really? Does the Klan even matter that much? Aren't they this lunatic fringe thing? How do you navigate that duality?
Yeah, it's a great question. I mean, so Derrick Black, who's the subject of this book, I think really his legacy in the white nationalist movement is that he did a lot of that active mainstreaming. I mean, Derrick's father had been the head of the KKK in the United States for a decade. His godfather is David Duke, the most notorious racist politician of modern times, although some competition lately. But I think Derrick, his legacy was that he convinced people like David Duke and his father to scrub Stormfront, the massive online community that they had built, to scrub it of racist slurs, to take down some of the Nazi insignia, and instead to try to talk about this issue in a way that would market to white people, and unfortunately a large number of white people in the country who still hold on to a false idea of white grievance. And so Derrick, when he was 19 years old, went around West Palm Beach, Florida, running for office for a seat on the Republican Council in West Palm Beach, and he would say things to voters like, "Isn't it too bad that there are so many signs in Spanish now in our neighborhood? Don't you think that there's more violence in the inner city? And isn't that because of the kind of people who live in the inner city?" He would spread these racist, false ideas and stereotypes without announcing himself as a racist. And in that manner, he got elected. So, David Duke, Don Black, Stormfront in general began to follow some of those ideas and try to, instead of speaking to outright racists, to try to market all of their ideas to a more, unfortunately and terrifyingly, mainstream, insidious racism that continues to drive a lot of what happens in the United States.
Well, I'm sure it's hard for people in Chicago to imagine a politician using such dog whistles as inner city,
exactly.
And
yeah.
But it does happen, I can assure you. But yeah, how do you how do you work people through? I mean, you're a descriptive journalist, right? You're not. This isn't a polemic. This isn't an argument-based book. But yet, you just in that answer you said, these are false ideas, they're really regrettable, they're really odious. Obviously, when you're dealing with literally the KKK and David Duke, it's pretty easy to draw those lines. As you get more into dog whistle territory, or aren't you worried about violence in your community territory, like, how do you figure out journalistically, and also just thinking this stuff through as a person, when to make that a super bright line and when it's a little bit harder to...
Yeah, I think that's a great question. And I think it's our job as journalists, and you do it really well in your own work, to make sure that we're anchoring the innuendo and the talking points to their very real history of racism and to what these people are actually saying. Because the truth is, what they have been trying to do in this movement for a long time is confuse and is sort of to try to make it more difficult to pin down the ways in what they are saying is racist. So, in this book, for instance, in the way that the language of immigration in the country has changed recently. Derrick and his father worked very hard on Stormfront to change the language of immigration on that platform. For a long time, they would refer to immigrants into the country as illegals, which I would say is offensive enough. That became infiltrators, and that became invaders. And I think tracking the very intentional use and the change in that language to suddenly putting us in part in a moment where we have a wartime language about immigration in the country. And I think it's really important to sort of examine what the language is and what it's actually saying.
Do you remember when that was? I mean, to use that example, when invaders became stormfronts?
I think invaders on Stormfront became the popular term shortly after President Obama was elected, which, not coincidentally for Stormfront, which for those of you lucky enough not to know, for 20 years was sort of the racist epicenter of the internet, a place with 300,000 members from around the world. Stormfront is translated every day into 5 different languages. And the night that President Obama was elected was their largest traffic night in the history of the website, and the website crashed under the weight of that new traffic. But the truth is, in the white nationalist movement, with David Duke and Don Black, their history with immigration goes back further in other ways that connect to our national moment. In the late 70s, David Duke and Don Black had been going around the South with the KKK at what they call cross-lightings, spreading fear and terror, mostly about race in the South, and they felt like that was getting stale. So David Duke came up with the idea that he wanted to sort of do a tour and try to get members of the national media to come to the border in Texas, where he would go and spend a week there driving around the border and talking about the idea of building a wall, a massive sort of monument to the exclusiveness of America and the whiteness of America. So immigration has been a pivot point for this movement for a while.
Yeah. So, you talk about the 70s. There are a few things in here where, naturally my eye was drawn to the, given what I write about, the technological means by which people are or are not able to propagate their message. Because, a lot of times, again, people sort of don't want to think of anything being new under the sun. They don't want to think of the internet as being, in any way a difference of kind. It's merely a difference of degree. And in many cases that's true, but in another sense there is a big shift happening when these ideas can spread so quickly. So a couple of the things I noticed in the way you tell this story, I think there was this book, Our Nordic Race, that Don found in the library. Now, there's always has to be a moment. I mean, this is true with Don Black, this is true with Derrick Black, this is true with anybody in any of these stories. There always has to be a moment where this poisonous ideology is introduced to them. In some ways, the poisonous ideology is just the background of what we're all exposed to as Americans, right? Obviously, this country was founded on white supremacy. This isn't something that was invented in Florida in the 70s. On the other hand, there is this interesting interplay, right? When Don Black kind of has his racial awakening, in sort of heavy air quotes, he both is and isn't. I mean, he's living in the segregated South, so obviously, again, racism is part of his life, but yet that level of aggressive, zealous, devoting his life to the racist cause, that is seen as gauche and embarrassing, and his parents sort of are embarrassed by it, and the FBI shows up at his house. So there's a lot in there, but I guess one way of putting the question is, how do you think about a world in which that chance encounter that someone like Don Black has with some fringe literature that happens to be in his local library could happen at any moment to anyone given the internet? Yeah,
I think it's scary. I know from having to spend time with Don Black and people like him that he thinks the greatest moment of his life as a white supremacist activist was when he created Stormfront, because that gave the movement more of a microphone than it ever had before.
Because he's imagining the next generation stumbling on things much more easily than he did.
Yeah, and they have stumbled on those things much more easily. I mean, when Don Black was a teenager in Alabama, and his high school was integrated during his senior year, he started going to the library and reading about race, and he found one racist organization in Washington, D.C., and started writing them letters and said, how can I get involved? It took a lot of effort, right? He had to find this place, write them letters. They said, oh, hey, we're having a conference soon. Why don't you go to a bus station in Birmingham? There are 2 other kids who've been writing us letters from other parts of the South. you can get on a bus with them and you can all come to this conference together. So Don Black shows up at the bus station in Birmingham, and at that point met the only two other white supremacist activists that he had ever met. And this was, one of them was David Duke, who would go on to be sort of the mainstream face of this movement. And the other was a guy named Joseph Paul Franklin, who would become a serial killer in an effort to start a race war. And those three people got in the car together and drove to a conference in Washington, D.C. And then Don, when he created Stormfront, he built out a platform that thousands and thousands and thousands of people could access with the click of a button. To him, I think it was a miracle. Obviously, to the rest of us, Stormfront has been the opposite of that.
Yeah. There was kind of a chilling moment in my research where a guy who's a background player, Sam Dixon, who also shows up in your stuff, he gives this kind of rousing speech at a alt-right white supremacist rally in Charlottesville, where he basically is giving a pep talk to these kids, saying, you don't know how good you have it. In my day, we had to go to these great lengths to find these pamphlets, and now, you're living in the best moment for this movement that's ever existed. So, people sometimes worry, like civil libertarian types will sometimes worry when you start talking this way, because it sounds like, oh, you want to ban books or you want to ban websites or something. I think that's obviously not the case. I mean, nobody wants to ban books. The question is, in your reporting, have you seen any sort of patterns or suggestions of how information can be organized in a way that doesn't lead people to radicalization? Like, is there anything that presents itself?
Yeah, that's a great question, and I think from your own work that some of the difficulty with tracking some of this hate speech and this recruiting in the white nationalist movement that happens online is that it turns into a bit of a game of whack-a-mole. Yeah. They migrate quickly, they adopt new technologies quickly, and it's difficult for anybody who's trying to keep up to do that. So I think some of the times when I've seen, I also think like right now we are in a dangerous moment for people to radicalize, because in the parts of the country that these white nationalists work to recruit and cultivate relationships, there are a lot of, frankly, younger white people who feel disaffected. And there are some reasons they feel disaffected that are legitimate. Their hospitals are closing in those parts of the country. Average life expectancy is going down. The middle class in much of rural America has not recovered. Suicide rates are up. Rates of loneliness are up. People are experiencing real pain. Then these white supremacist groups come in and say, these things are happening to you not because of anything you're doing, not because of your own inadequacies, but because of people who look like this. That is not true. That is false. The truth is that rural communities that have more immigration tend to be the healthiest communities, but that's a very powerful thing to offer people. So I think we're seeing a lot of that recruiting happening now, which scares me. The most effective response that I have seen is not by policing speech, which I know for both of us as journalists is something, the First Amendment is something that's very important to us. But I think is when communities find a way, sometimes in really smart and creative ways, to make clear what kind of speech and what kind of things they're willing to hear and listen to, and what kind of things they're not willing to hear and listen to. And the examples when that happens, I think that's when a really powerful message is sent.
Yeah. So, and another thing, I mean, we'll get to how that happened specifically in this college community, because I think it's important to break down what that story does and doesn't teach us. The first thing, though, is when you show up in a lot of these communities, sometimes they point to the other being the brown or the black or the, gay or trans, but I think in my delving into these worlds, was surprised at the extent to which they're obsessed with Jews. I don't know if that surprised you. It obviously, it shows up in your work too. Did that surprise you, and did it affect your reporting?
Yeah, it surprised me a lot. And it's probably, although it's upsetting to talk about, because unfortunately we all are at a moment when I think we have to talk about this in our country, it's probably worth outlining what white nationalists are and what it is that they really believe in their awful paradigm of beliefs. So, white nationalists I use as a term to describe people who are actively pushing for greater white supremacy in the country. It's sometimes confusing to talk about them as white supremacists because, as you said, so much of the country we exist in now remains white supremacist in terms of its structures, in terms of our criminal justice system, and on it goes. So this group of white nationalists, what they say they believe, and again, these things are false and don't hold up to modern science, but they believe that based on the false science they propagate of IQ score differentials, of testosterone differentials, some very crazy conspiracy theories in many cases. They believe that white people in general are inherently superior to people of color. And they believe that Jews, who they do not consider white, they believe that Jews are running a conspiracy using a greater share of power in the country in terms of whether it's influence in banking or Hollywood to bring more people of color into the country to weaken what these white nationalists conceive of as the great European race. So that was a surprise to me. I didn't understand sort of where Judaism fell in the paradigm of these beliefs. And all of their beliefs are horrible. None of it is more horrible than anything else. But for me and for my last name, it certainly made some of my reporting in these spaces more complicated.
Yeah, and it also is just more kind of Byzantine and confusing. Like, it's one thing to just sort of have a chart of racial hierarchy, and even though, as you say, it's based on pseudoscience, it's sort of been the same pseudoscience all along. And so we're used to it, and we're like, oh, you're just those people who are still like measuring skulls with calipers or whatever. Like,
right.
I get what that is. When it becomes this other thing where it's like, but actually Jews have higher IQs, and they're the ones who are masterminding the border thing, that gets really complicated. And that actually, just so everybody knows, when the people in Charlottesville were chanting, Jews will not replace us, they chanted, you will not replace us, and then they chanted, Jews will not replace us. That didn't mean like the country is being overrun with too many Jews, because there aren't that many of them.
Right.
It meant Jews are masterminding the conspiracy to bring in the non-white hordes so that they could be part of a coalition of ethnic minorities.
Right, which traces the same line to the synagogue shooting in Pittsburgh,
right.
A year ago. It is crazy, and frankly, many of these white nationalist ideas are crazy. And what is reassuring in writing about them, it's comforting to know that the science, none of it is on their side. It is on the side of the anti-racist. And in fact, when pressed on their beliefs, white nationalists who I spoke to and talked to about their ideas, what they also want is, in the end, they think that people of different races, ideally, in their great future that they're trying to imagine, they think people of different races should be separated, ideally by continent, by a significant amount of space. But when pressed on who is white, who gets to stay in this great utopia that they're imagining in their minds, they have an impossible time answering that. Because as many of these recent genetic tests have revealed, and people on these places like Stormfront take them, the idea of any sort of pure whiteness as they've constructed in their head doesn't frankly exist in most genetic ways.
Well, so when you were around these people, because you don't write about it in the first person, but it's obviously clear from reading it that you spent a massive amount of time with these people. When you were with, I mean, I guess, Richard Spencer doesn't really count because he spends all day talking to the Jewish media. He's, I know from personal experience, he claims to not do it and then turns around and does it. And you document very carefully how he does that. But when you're with, Don Black, how does this stuff come up? Is he sort of like pressing you on Jewishness and, the plot to take over the world, or is he sort of sublimating that? And is it awkward? Like, how does that?
Yeah, it's again, as you know from your work, it's awkward. I never felt physically threatened. I took precautions. I would let somebody know where I was going to be, how long I would be there. But I also knew that in particular, Derrick's father, Don Black, I knew he was essential to telling this story, in part because while Don Black has spent his life causing huge amounts of terror and doing horrific things, he also was a father who really loved his kid and who was so intensely proud of Derrick and who he was. And Derrick, when he broke away from this movement and vowed to fight back, the hardest part of that for him, the thing that held him to this ideology longer than anything else, was knowing that by doing that, he was essentially going to be stabbing a knife into his father's heart, and they were likely not to talk again.
That they were going to sit Shiva for him.
Right, exactly. So I knew I needed to spend a lot of time with Don, and Don, I think, because we were usually talking about Derrick, enjoyed it, because for him it was reminiscing about the great times in his life when Derrick was with him in this movement and when they were doing this work together. So because Don enjoyed it, I think he tried to find ways to put me in his in-group, and would say things like, well, like, what % Jewish are you really? Like, who in your family is or isn't Jewish? And because as a reporter, I'm trying to form relationships with the people that I write about based on honesty. I'm asking them to give me the truth all the time. It also is my responsibility to be honest with them. So when I'm honest about the answers to those questions, and they are not the answers that somebody like Don Black wants to hear, it's awkward. But he continued sitting there and spending time and talking with me.
Yeah, it's funny. I had very similar experiences I had this one guy who, my project was more spread out. It wasn't just one person's story. But one guy I spent a lot of time focusing on was the guy who founded the podcast called The Daily Shoah, which is a very funny pun because Shoah means Holocaust. And but it's like this sort of like shock jock style podcast. A lot of these guys, actually, it's funny, the connection with your world. They call Stormfront WN 1.0, white nationalism 1.0.
Right. And
their thing is white nationalism 2.0, because it's like the funny, like hip, web savvy, young, cool version.
Right.
So when they founded this podcast, he sort of became the kind of Cyrano of Richard Spencer's ideology. He was kind of like the propagandist guy behind the guy of the alt-right. I didn't think he would ever talk to me, and I went and talked to his family and his parents who had disowned him, and his other set of parents who hadn't disowned him and who were in fact like buying him shirts to go on TV in Charlottesville so he looked better. And eventually he did call me out of the blue and sort of in this kind of vaguely threatening way. And I sat down to have this, what turned out to be, I thought he was just going to troll me for 10 minutes and use it for his podcast, because they all record their calls. But it ended up being this like 3-hour conversation, and he really opened up to me. And right at the time that he was about to sort of say, you should really read Kevin MacDonald's work, I think you'd really like it, he stopped him. This is like the book that lays out how the Jews are at the center of it's like the modern protocols of the elders of Zion.
Right.
And it was the book that really red-pilled him. As he was recommending this book to me, he stops and goes, wait, you're not Jewish, are you? And I was like, you knew my name. You could have Googled me at any time. Also, the thing you brag about all the time is your Jewdar. Like, they're constantly bragging about, because the thing that freaks them out is that Jews can pass as white, but they're not actually white. So they're constantly saying, we are the leaders because we can show the hoodwinked white people where the Jews are and name the Jew. And he couldn't even figure me out. I was like, dude. But it shows how muddled and confusing and fictitious this stuff all is.
Totally.
And also, I wonder about your process with this, because in that interview, and in many other interviews, especially when you're not face-to-face with someone as a reporter, you have to come up with some way of drawing people out.
Yep.
And my way, which I didn't realize at the time, was to go, right. So as he was like, this is why we need to deport everyone to Israel and we need to build a wall, I'd be like, right. And then I was like, maybe I shouldn't be saying that.
Right.
Did you?
Yeah. It's hugely challenging.
Do you just rely on silence a lot of the time, or what do you do tactically?
Yeah, I think in this case I relied on silence a lot more. Also, that when I was, for my work typically as a journalist, I write for the Washington Post, and the journalism that I do, when I'm reporting about people, I'm spending huge amounts of time with the people that I'm writing about. If somebody's getting deported from the United States to Mexico, I don't just call and talk to them about it. I'm there when the ICE flight lands in Mexico, and I spend the first few weeks back in the lime fields with them as they're figuring out family separation. My reporting is all about proximity. So in this case, I was spending a lot of time in person with these people. and noticed all of the same tendencies myself, right? I mean, the way we build trust, not just as journalists, but as people, is by being empathetic and by listening actively. And that is not something that you want to do when somebody is saying, oh, by the way, the Holocaust didn't happen. You don't want to default to, oh, yeah. So I was very conscious of trying not to give them that kind of confirmation. And I think I learned that there are still ways to be an attentive listener, a good listener, and asking good, critical, intense questions without doing that. The amazing truth about being a journalist is that almost everybody wants to have themselves heard. People believe that their lives and perspectives are interesting, and to me, for anything that I'm writing about, they are. They're really interesting. I want to know everything. So, when I'm with somebody like Don Black, I am giving him an audience for, in the case of this book, I probably made 4 trips to Florida where he lives, where day after day I would go sit down with him at a restaurant and we would talk about his life and Derrick's life and all of the things that he had done, which to me, and which when held up to the light as fact, and confirmed with sort of FBI files and everything else, are atrocious acts. But to Don, those were the facts of his life. He was like, oh yeah, I did try to overthrow Dominica and turn it into a white utopia. Let me tell you about that plan.
They made it about 2 miles down the road.
Right, exactly. So, I think I tried very hard to not allow myself in any way to let them feel like I was confirming what they were saying or on their side. And when asked, as I'm sure you often were, I would say, no, this is not what I believe. Let's get back to what you're talking about.
Right, because you are honest about your opinions, but you also don't stand up and leave every time they say something offensive, or you would never.
The term, I don't know if this was a term you got sometimes, but I felt like the white nationalist term when they were talking and hearing that you were listening was, are you sympathetic? No, I'm not sympathetic. Let's keep talking. Yeah.
Yeah, which is why they are so interested in being like, well, at least you're white, right?
Right.
And you're like, depends.
Not that either, right? Yeah.
Depends on your definition.
Right.
So there's so much I want to get into, and especially, and you bring up journalism, and actually journalism plays a big role in Derrick's story too, both with the details story and with SPLC. But first, I think to lay the groundwork, I want to talk about how Derrick got de-radicalized. We can't do the long version because the long version is the book, but the short version, and what you think that does or doesn't teach us about our current moment, because I think there's a way of reading it and there's an opposite way of reading it, and I want to hear your take.
Sure. I'll do the shortest version I can, compressing the book in. So, Derrick, in many ways, was indoctrinated with these ideas, right? He grew up in a house where Don Black and David Duke were the greatest influences around him. They pulled him out of the public schools when he was in 4th grade because they didn't want him to be around people who looked or thought in any way different than they did. So Derrick spent his childhood traveling around to white nationalist conferences. He existed within the bubble of this racist world. I think what was disastrous was that Derrick also is really smart.
Well, this is what I was going to say. It felt like they lucked out. When they pick a new Dalai Lama when they're like a year old, and you're like,
yeah.
How'd you know that guy was going to be so smart? Like,
right,
it was kind of like that.
Yeah, so Derrick was really smart and began to invest himself in these ideas. And so by the time he was 11 years old, he'd built his own website, a compendium to Stormfront that was a white pride site for kids that was visited 500,000 times. He started a whole radio network for Stormfront. He had his own mainstream show on the airways in Florida where he would talk about these racist ideas. Then he was elected to office. He'd risen up to the top of this movement. And the night after President Obama was elected, at the big sort of racist, neo-Nazi, KKK, racist academics, or racialists as they call themselves, they all got together to talk about what to do next. And Derrick gave the keynote speech and said, the way ahead for this movement is through politics and through becoming explicitly a white people's party, and that's the way we will advance our ideas. So Derrick was really at the top of this movement, and then a little bit later than most people, because he'd been homeschooled, decided he wanted to go to college. He thought, he really liked learning. He wanted to get a PhD. He also thought he could advance farther as a white nationalist, mainstreaming these ideas with a credential that was mainstream. So Derrick decided to go to the best school and the cheapest school that he could, which was this little honors college in Florida called New College. And New College is like the ideological opposite to white supremacy or to the white nationalist movement. New College is a place where they uphold individualism and diversity and fight for it at all costs, and the students there are really invested in that. It's a place where they're worried about microaggressions and mispronouncing people, and then onto that space steps like the future heir to the white nationalist movement. So Derrick, as I said, he's smart, so he realized pretty quickly if these other students knew who he was, his life was going to be made miserable. So he made kind of a compromise with himself where he would sort of act like a normal college student in the dorms, kind of befriending whoever walked by, beginning to make some connections on this campus. But he would remain the heir to this white supremacist movement in his public life. So he would walk out from the dorms and go to a quiet spot on the quad where he would call into the radio show that he and his father still had on the airways every day. And he would say horrible things, spreading prejudices oftentimes about the very people that he was befriending on that campus. And that secret life at this school lasted for almost a year until another student was doing a research paper on the primary extremist threats to the United States, went on to the Southern Poverty Law Center website and saw a picture of a kid that he sat next to in math class. And at that point, this campus basically exploded into a debate that I think all of us in our own ways are having now, which is, what do you do? What do you do when you are faced with awful and horrific ideas that if maybe they upset you, but maybe they also dehumanize you, and maybe they make you feel afraid? How do you respond to that? And the ideas at New College were radically different. But the one universal decision that pretty much everybody at that school made, that I think is the first step, is they decided to do something. Nobody at New College thought, like, well, let's just go back to class and not really worry about this. They began having an active debate on their own internet forum about what they could do to impact Derrick spreading these ideas and doing it sometimes from campus. So the first thing that happened is a group of students, white students, students of color, a large part of the campus decided, screw this guy. Like, we need to ostracize him. We need to make him feel vulnerable in the ways that he's made everybody else feel vulnerable. And so they began working on a campaign to shut down New College of Florida in protest of Derrick's ideas and the fact that he was there. And they were successful in doing that. For the first time in 45 years, New College canceled classes for a day because of these student activists, and held a day where they talked about inclusion and racism and the type of things that Derrick were saying and why they were so awful. And students would flip Derrick off as he walked to class. This campaign of exclusion was really successful, and I think in its own way was an act of courage by these students on this campus. They made Derrick, for the first time in his life, in the eyes of a peer community, feel a little bit vulnerable in the same ways he'd often made other people feel vulnerable. And also, Derrick, I think, thought, can this many smart people be wrong? And he started a little bit to feel a little bit more shaky about his ideology. Then other students on campus began to make the opposite choice. They said, instead of confrontation, let's try invitation. And the first few students to do that were two Jewish students on the campus, students who'd gotten to know Derrick during that first year before they knew that he was, a white supremacist wunderkind. And these students, Matthew and Moshe, printed out all of the awful things Derrick had written about Jews on Stormfront over the years and put it in their dorm room so they could be reminded of the horrors of his ideology. And yet, despite that, they decided, let's begin inviting him over. And maybe if he comes, maybe if he starts spending time with us, maybe if he begins to care about us in some way, he'll start seeing beyond the prejudices to the people and to the humanity. So they began holding essentially these weekly dinners, Shabbat dinners, where Derrick, because he had no other invitations and because he'd been friends with these two people a little bit before he was outed on campus, he started coming. And over time, as other students at this campus began to see that Derrick was not threatening anybody, he wasn't hitting anybody at those dinners. In fact, sometimes he was showing up with a bottle of kosher wine. Other students began to get curious and began to get a little bit normalized to Derrick's presence, and they would show up at these dinners, and little by little they would tell him about their own lives. A new Peruvian immigrant to the country talked about what it was like for his family not to have status. A Haitian immigrant who'd grown up in Orlando talked about what it was like to get stopped and frisked by the police all the time. And another student at that table, Allison, began to debate Derrick vigorously on the facts of his ideology and would show him the real science of IQ scores. And because Derrick was beginning to trust these people and like them, he opened up his ears and he started clicking on the emails that they sent. He started hearing the stories that they told him. And little by little, over the course of 3 years of really active, hard work by the students on this campus, both in terms of civil resistance and discourse, the scaffolding of Derrick's ideology began to fall away.
Well, and I think it's important to draw both of those things out, and we're going to get into it more. In a few minutes, we're going to take some questions, and I'd like to get into this more there because I've heard this story described as these two courageous kids invited a white nationalist to Shabbat dinner, and they healed their divide.
Right.
And I think that's an oversimplification, just as you described. If there wasn't this other background context of anger and confrontation, it might not have worked in that way. The other thing that makes this a little more complicated and potentially uncomfortable is, in some sense, it's easier when the person you're dealing with is literally David Duke's godson. Where it gets trickier is, what if it's someone who is maybe not, actively propagating these views but is okay with these views? Or what if it's someone who, wants to put babies in cages? That's not one person in the country or 1% of the country.
Right.
So then what lessons do we draw from that? Like, where do you see, in thinking through this book and talking about it with people, not to be too prescriptive about it, but just how do you stop it from it just being contained to, if it's literally this one person, the one heir to the movement, what do we do with the cases that edge closer into the gray area?
Yeah, I think it's a great question. Sometimes I think we like to comfort ourselves by believing that racist ideas are held by like a small number of radical bad actors, and that we could never be like them. Also, I think we comfort ourselves by thinking oftentimes that racists and people who have racist ideas are not smart. The much scarier truth is that some of these people are very smart. And even worse, these racist ideas have their power because, tragically, for this country's history and for our current moment, they are inherently American and have been a part of what this country has been since the beginning. And I think, that is what makes this work so essential. There are polls consistently show about a quarter, and as we were talking backstage, you said it's even gone up maybe to 30 or 40% now, of white people in the country who believe that they are discriminated against, that they suffer more prejudice than people of color or Jews. That is crazy. That doesn't hold up to any fact that we have about inequality in the country and where people's lives are. But the fact that that much false white grievance continues to exist is what gives these racist ideas power. That's what gets people elected. It might be people like Derrick sometimes and others who are pushing the ideas, but it's the fact that there's such a receptive audience willing to hear those ideas and willing to vote based on those ideas that makes these ideas powerful. So I think, one of the things that the students on that new college campus did that was really smart is they said, yes, this is about Derrick, but it's also about all of the other things that are happening on this campus. It's about the fact that I'm a student of color and I walk into the dorm and they ask for my ID when they don't ask for anybody else's ID. And so when they shut down the campus, that day became let's not just all point at the one overt racist and let all of these other things go. Let's make sure that we're having this conversation in the space it needs to be had, which is that this exists on a spectrum, and unfortunately, a spectrum that takes up a huge part of what America is.
Yeah, it's not some remote fringe thing. I, speaking of sort of agreement and where it's possible for normies like us to find agreement with these fringe people we're covering, one thing I did find myself agreeing with various white nationalists when I talked to them about was they will point to the preamble to the Constitution and say, we ordain and establish for ourselves and our posterity. Someone like a Richard Spencer will point to that and say, that means white people.
Right.
And I actually agree with that. I think that this country was founded as a white nationalist country.
That's exactly the problem. That's why this ideology, I think, is so scary, is that its fuel, as a terrorist movement, white nationalism is not, it doesn't have necessarily huge amounts of money or huge amounts of funding. What it has is a driving force where they say what we are fighting for is essentially American. The people on places like Stormfront, and I'm sure you saw it everywhere else, who are quoted as like the icons of this movement are people like Thomas Jefferson. And so the work of confronting this ideology and confronting these ideas also means confronting what is at this country's core, and that's what makes the work so difficult.
Which is why, and we're going to go to questions now, but after Charlottesville, when people were protesting around a Robert E. Lee statue, and you heard people like Trump and Bannon saying, what's next, Thomas Jefferson, George Washington? It's like, I don't know, man.
Right, yeah.
I don't know. All right, so let's open it up for questions.
Thank you.
Yeah.
So a couple of things before we get started. Please make sure to speak into the microphone so that everyone can hear. Please do be brief and pose your question as a question so that we can get to everyone. So go ahead and raise your hand. We've got a couple of mics going around. Let's start right down here in the center. Do you mind passing that? Oh, thank you.
Hi, I'd like to know why both of you were so surprised at the amount of anti-Semitism in the white nationalist movement. I mean, there's been anti-Semitism in this country since its inception.
Yeah.
You want to go first?
Yeah, I guess what I would say is I wasn't surprised that there was anti-Semitism. What I was surprised by was its centrality and how much, I mean, we think of white supremacy as being about ideas of racial supremacy and racial hierarchy. And what was confusing to me about it was that by their pseudoscience of IQ, you would think if you just read the bell curve or something that they would just say, oh, Jews are great because they, according to our schema, are high IQ people who are model minorities, and I just didn't think that they would be so obsessed with rooting out the Jew as the root of all evil. I knew that there has been the Merchant of Venice and there's been the Bible. I mean, I wasn't naive about the existence of anti-Semitism. I just didn't realize that it was the center of their cosmology.
Yeah, I think that's all true, but I would also say, unfortunately, in this moment, even more anti-Semitism is being unearthed around us over the last few years. I've been talking about this book a lot on college campuses, and somebody who does anti-hate work on college campuses told me last week that incidents of Nazi graffiti on college campuses have gone up 310% in the last 3 years. I think the fact that it's not only that they're propagating that anti-Semitism, but that tragically it's resonating is the really scary thing. Because of course, historically, it has resonated again and again.
The other thing, I thought they would be a little more, they're so interested in changing with the times and rebranding and going, oh, that logo isn't cool anymore, we're gonna use this logo. I just thought it would be like, we're doing Islamophobia now, we're doing transphobia now, like this is so quaint. Like why are we still recycling these old tropes?
I guess they can do all of it, yeah.
Yeah, it's play the hits again and again.
We've got a question right down here over to your left.
Hi. I read your book last spring and then recommended it to our book group, and we're reading it We're reading it for next Wednesday.
Oh, thanks.
So it was like quite a synchronistic thing that you were coming through Chicago, so I was very grateful for that.
I appreciate
Anyways, my question is about Derrick. I'm really interested in knowing what you can tell us about what he's doing. I know he's very private, but I felt very sympathetic towards him and your portrayal of this change that he went through, and I just, I'm very curious.
Yeah, thanks for asking. So I think when I first found Derrick, which was sort of in a sideways way through covering another white nationalist terrorist attack in the country. Dylan Roof had gone into a church in Charleston, South Carolina. He had murdered 10 people. And he'd been, he'd sort of radicalized in part on Stormfront. So I went on Stormfront to read the things he'd been reading as I was writing about him. And the largest thread on the message board was about Derrick, who had just disavowed this ideology. So that's kind of how I came to the story and how I tried to start to find him. At that point, Derrick was basically in hiding. He'd changed his name. He'd moved across the country because all of these neo-Nazis and skinheads on Stormfront were saying, this is the preeminent traitor to our movement. How do we find him? What do we do? And I think it took a year and maybe 2 years from when I found Derrick to when he felt comfortable even meeting me. And part of that was because of the very real physical risks. I think another part was because he was still hoping at that point that maybe all of these seeds he'd planted in the ground, maybe all of these racist talking points that he'd helped spread, maybe they would stay there and he could sort of walk away quietly. And over that next year and a half, he began to see all of those seeds, in fact, growing all around him. And so he eventually decided, I have to speak up, not because it's the courageous thing to do, but because it's the only fundamentally decent thing to do. And I think since the publication of the book, that's the same decision that Derrick has made again and again. I think he feels like being silent in this moment is like being complicit. And so what he's done is continue to invest more of his own work, but also I would say more of his own shame and guilt and pain that he still feels about the legacy that he has in this space into anti-racist work. So now he's partnered with an author and academic named Ibram Kendi at an anti-racist center at American University in DC. And Derrick is, he worked with Facebook to try to help them deal with the spread of extremism on that platform. And now he actually is part of this group called Life After Hate, which tries to do de-radicalization work in some of those online spaces too. So he has a complicated life ahead because he doesn't feel good about himself. Because the truth is, I'm always really careful to talk about his story, and I know he is too. Not as a redemption story, but as a transformation story, because much of the damage that he did cannot be redeemed. Derrick doesn't know how many people were marching in Charlottesville because they visited his white pride site for kids. He does know that when some of these white nationalist shooters commit atrocious acts, they come out of there re-spreading his talking points, the same things that he said 10 years ago on the radio. And so I think Derrick feels huge amounts of guilt. And I think he's decided for the moment that the only thing to do with that is to reinvest it back into the work on the other side. Thanks for asking.
Take another question. We've got a question right over there.
I'm having trouble reconciling your continuing to call Derrick smart and others in the movement smart, when it seems to me the ideology is really based on fear and prejudice and insecurity. And I'm wondering if you could talk more about why you're using that descriptor and what it means and how we can get through to people if we're assuming that they're smart and we have to be smarter?
Sure. I'll take a crack and then I'll let you go. I mean, the first thing that I would say is that smart people are also fearful and insecure, and and afraid. And Derrick, in the part of this white nationalist movement that he grew up in, it was mostly going to conferences of people who called themselves academics, who had PhD credentials, like David Duke, and they would go to hotel ballrooms in cities like Chicago, Memphis, all around the country, and they would get together and they would spread racist talking points that they had tried to use science to back up. And they had taken advantage, they'd used their intelligence to take advantage of that and to push these ideas. Fear, othering people, certainly a part of it, but I think that those sensations do not make people not intelligent. I think those are widespread things around the country. So in terms of like us being more smart, like it is comforting to me again and again that when you look at all of this science, when you look at the sort of false science that they've applied to their ideology, it doesn't hold up. It's not even close. So when confronted with better science, Derrick began to listen, but he started to listen in part because he'd built relationship and trust with those people around him. And it's not that he hadn't seen those other studies before, he just ignored them because the people he cared about believed the same ideas that he did. He was surrounded by confirmation bias all the time. So some of it, I think, is not just using intelligence to give people better ideas, but also sometimes, when possible, building connections with people so they might listen to those ideas, or making them feel vulnerable enough that they have to listen to those ideas.
Yeah, I would echo a lot of that. I mean, I guess, so I write for The New Yorker, and in one of my New Yorker pieces, I wanted to refer to one of these people as smart. And the New Yorker pieces are very heavily fact-checked. So the fact-checker came to me and said, I don't know, I think I gotta flag this. I don't think, people in his family had referred to him as the smartest one in the family. And the fact-checker said, I don't doubt that they said that, but how can you be the smartest one in your family when you come to these monumentally stupid conclusions? And it was literally a fact-checking discussion like any other fact-checking discussion, and he was marshaling evidence, and I was like, Isaac Newton believed that the world was gonna end before he was like a virgin his whole life because he thought that the apocalypse was coming any minute. That seems to me like not a rational thing to believe, but he was Isaac Newton. So the point being that, like, I'm being a little bit glib about it, but like, Thomas Jefferson used his monumental intellect to write beautiful rhetorical flourishes about why black people needed to remain enslaved, as sad as he was about it. People use their intelligence. There's research showing that the more intelligent you are as a climate denier, the more likely you are to stay a climate denier because you can marshal more evidence to support your incorrect views. So we shouldn't at all conflate intelligence with correctness, but we shouldn't be naive about the fact. I think part of what's so terrifying about this is that you don't have to be some rube or some dupe. I mean, certainly some people are, but I think that we should confront the reality that you can have a lot of horsepower upstairs and use it for the wrong things. As for whether to beat it with better science, I agree that it can be beaten and should be beaten with better science. I also think that in the social media aspect of it, which is more what I focus on, it shouldn't always be the case that everything bad has to be responded to or shouted down. It's always case by case. Sometimes when you're in the right situation, when you're at the right dinner with the right kosher wine or whatever, you can get into an argument and out-argue people, but sometimes they're just trolling and they're trying to get you to amplify their message by shouting back at it. So it's complicated, right? The truth ultimately can win out, but it doesn't mean that it will, and sometimes the structure of the marketplace of ideas is not built in that way, so sometimes it is better to just leave it alone.
Yeah.
We've got a question right over here to your left.
Hi, what causes me the most angst about this country is the 40% or so that support Trump. And I've heard the pundits ad nauseum about it's not all racism, it's about, economics and so. But how much of that plays into the gray area that you were talking about, like the Republican being elected by saying certain dog whistle type things?
Why don't you take it first?
It's the first I'm hearing of this. Yeah, I mean, yes, Trump says racist stuff all the time. It's horrifying and terrible for our country. But I think to Eli's point earlier, Trump didn't invent the American tradition of white supremacy. He's just playing on it. So I think to your question about is it really race or is it really economic anxiety, I think, yes, there's been a lot of research, especially recently, that a lot of voters are driven more by their racial fears than by their economic fears. But I don't think that it's a dichotomy, right? I think when people ask that question, I don't think you're doing this, but I think a lot of pundits will sort of say, they'll pit these two things against each other. It's become a trope at this point, where people in swing states voting because of economic anxiety or because of racial anxiety. But we know that these things are always interpenetrated. Like, the actual Nazis were experiencing economic anxiety because of inflation, which helped lead to the actual Hitler. So there's not like a clear distinction between these two. People experience economic anxiety and racial anxiety in situations when it's not rational to do so. There is no actual threat of immigration in the states where there is the highest fear of immigration. There is no actual economic anxiety to people who fear it most, and vice versa, people who experience very real economic strictures that threaten their actual life expectancies will often vote in ways that are seen to be against their own interests. So I guess the bottom line is it's not always something that would show up neatly in an economics textbook. It's not always like, you'll vote the way that will materially benefit you in the short term. But in the long term, the ideology of white supremacy underlies a lot more of our politics than I think we've really come to grips with, which I think is the point you're really making, that people are in some sense voting in their interest, even when they're voting to shut down a health clinic that they might benefit from, or voting to take away their own Medicaid because they are ultimately voting in the interest of white supremacy.
We've got a question right over there, Vincent, right in the middle. He's coming to you with the mic.
I'm reminded of a statement that denial is not just a river in Egypt, and that what you're talking about is that smart people can deny things in a very dumb way, but they can still be smart. So what we're working against is people who are denying climate change, who are denying differences that happen that we can document, but they're in denial about it. Those people, you can't change it. They have to decide to not deny it anymore, I believe. What do you think about that?
Well, I think changing people's minds about anything is difficult. This story, I think Derrick was in the time in his life when his big ideas about the world were most likely to change. There's a stage called fluid identity. Psychologists say it's in between about 17 and 25. You're the most likely to challenge your big frameworks. So it's not a coincidence that this happened in college. But I also guess that I would say Matthew, one of the students who kept having Derrick over to dinner, who kept having him come over to his house week after week after week, even as sometimes in between those Friday night dinners, he would see that Derrick had been at a conference in Tennessee on stage with David Duke. Matthew started to get really frustrated, right? Felt like I'm having no impact on this kid whatsoever. Like week after week, he comes here, he eats our food, he makes nice, he smiles at us, and then he goes and he says these horrible things again and again. And some of these students started to say basically, I don't want to come anymore. Like, I don't want to be around. Maybe we're just making his life more comfortable. But Matthew sort of said something to them that sticks with me when I think about our obligation in terms of trying to impact particularly people who might listen to us or people who care about us, which Matthew said was, it's our job to push the rock, not necessarily to move the rock. And I think that that's a powerful mindset, that it still is worth trying, because especially with these big transformations, you don't know what seed or what idea or what real science you're planting that might at some point be something that somebody points back to as one of the things that helped them stop denying. And I think that's particularly important now at a moment when our country is increasingly polarized. And when we are more likely to exist in spaces of denial than we ever have before. You know, we cultivate our own news feeds. We're more likely to hear ideas from people who think like us. So I think when it's possible to make somebody hear an idea that is not like the things that they are hearing, that might break them out of that space, whether it's through a conversation or through a message of another kind, I think that's worth trying to do. Thanks for asking.
We've got time for one last question right back here. Before we do, though, please be aware that we will be having a book signing with Eli in the small gym. Take a right as you leave and another right to get into the gym.
Thank you. How much, if any, influence do you think that the transformation of this one person that has now gotten a lot of publicity means for others who might want to do the same thing? Is it helping in any way at all?
I hope so. I mean, it's I'd say the most difficult feedback that I get to the book, and I'm curious if you've gotten some of this, and I would imagine over the next months you will, is notes from parents whose parents are slipping down the same paths toward radicalization, and parents who are feeling helpless, basically saying, what do I do? I've noticed that my kid is spending more time in these places. How do I deal with that? You know, certainly I have gotten other notes saying that the book has helped people confront some of their ideas, but you know, happily, this book has not been popular or received well in places like Stormfront. So, you know, I think the challenge is. The challenge in de-radicalizing people and in convincing people to come away from these ideas is that, you know, for somebody who is existing in that community in a big way, they are not just getting an ideology, they're getting their relationships, their sense of identity. They are, you know, radical groups are successful when they make people feel like a part of a community or even a part of a family. Like they give somebody an in-group. Certainly that was the case for Derrick. So I think sometimes the challenge with de-radicalizing is people are giving up not only their ideas, but their sense of self. And so the challenging thing for all of us, I think, is to try to create communities where that's possible. I mean, what do you think?
Yeah, I definitely, I think it's not as one-to-one a correlation as we would hope that, you know, there will just be a mass exodus from these movements because of the social ties that people have. But I do think it shows what's possible, and it shows a way out for people. You know, it's, I think, very easy for people to go, especially in online spaces, and sort of say, so many big online spaces are so populated by such toxic, tragic disinformation that we should kind of just give up. But you can't really give up on the public square in that way. It doesn't really work. So in a sense, I think part of what it does is just light a fire under people to say, you know, YouTube doesn't have to be full of proto-fascist recruiting tools. It could be taken over by better stuff. And the only thing that's preventing that from happening is essentially people just aren't doing the work. So that, it's not foreordained. There's no sort of arc of history pushing us into or out of, you know, the place we want to get to. We just have to sort of do the work. So I don't think it'll automatically happen and people will fall in line, but I think it shows that they can move in that direction if they're so inspired.
And I think going back to an earlier point that we talked about, fortunately, few of us in our lives are going to have a chance to transform the future heir to the white supremacist movement, right? There aren't that many Derricks. And yes, he was unique in that he was in a stage in his life when he was likely to make a change. He was curious, he valued information, you know, he was empathetic. He had a lot of things going for him in this transformation. He also had way more to lose than almost anybody else, right? Derrick's, every bit of his identity was staked into this movement, and every one of the relationships from the first 21 years in his life were about furthering white supremacy. And when he gave that up, he knew he would be cutting himself off from those first 21 years. So I think if somebody who's that steeped in this ideology and who has that much to lose is capable of being challenged and confronted, it gives me hope that we can all do what I would say is the much more necessary and widespread work of confronting insidious racist ideas that are shared all around us all the time by people who aren't just like Derrick.
Yeah. Let's end there. Thank you so much.
Thanks, guys.